So we saw in the last video that during a normal menstrual cycle, close to the end of those 28 days, the corpus luteum dies off, menstruation begins, and the lining of the uterus is lost. But in that environment, a fertilized egg would not survive. It would be lost with the lining of the uterus. So what needs to happen during pregnancy is that we have to prevent menstruation. We have to keep the lining of the uterus very thick. And so this corpus luteum, we have to keep it alive somehow past the 12 days. So if the egg finds a partner and is fertilized by that sperm and begins to develop and wants to implant, I have to keep this lining of this corpus luteum has to stay alive in order to keep the lining of the uterus nice and thick and healthy. How can we keep that corpus luteum alive beyond those 12 days? How can we keep that corpus luteum alive beyond those 12 days? Here's a secret. So if the embryo happens to implant, what it's going to start doing is producing its own hormone known as HCG or human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. But this hormone produced by the embryo will talk to the ovary and the corpus luteum and keep it alive and sustain it beyond those 12 days. And if the corpus luteum stays alive, it'll keep making progesterone, which will keep the lining of the uterus nice and thick. And this is why this hormone, HCG, is the basis for pregnancy tests. Because if you're making this hormone, that means that an embryo if you're making this hormone, not only has an egg been fertilized by a sperm, but it has developed into this embryo, and this embryo has implanted in the lining of the uterus. So, pregnant. Interestingly though, another thing that progesterone will do is not only maintain the lining of the uterus, but it actually also serves as a plug in the cervix to try to prevent additional fertilizations during that pregnancy. All right, so we've gone through the normal sequence of a menstrual cycle, both during months when there's not fertilization, no pregnancy, and what happens during the course of pregnancy, or at least what starts it. So let's just quickly recap all the goals that we were trying to accomplish and revisit how we accomplished each of those goals. So the first goal was to cause the egg to fully mature inside the ovary. And so that meant what we need to do was to take these developing oocytes and force them to resume meiosis and also develop the follicle. Because we needed to make an egg that only had one copy of each chromosome at the end. We said that FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, was what was necessary to trigger the maturation of that follicle, of that egg. And I just wanted to quickly introduce exactly how FSH causes that to happen, because again, it'll help us review for the final. But in my view, it's actually the coolest GPCR in your entire body. So I think I said that the most powerful one was the beta 1 GPCR on your SA node in the ventricles. That one is super important. But this one I think is really awesome because it's what's necessary for life, for the development of this follicle. And here's what happens. So right here is basically the developing follicle. So it's the lining of that egg or the ovum. But on that lining, we have these GPCRs. So just like the normal GPCRs we've seen in the past. And what happens is when FSH is released during the menstrual cycle, it's a signaling molecule that binds to this GPCR activates the G protein just like we've seen in the past, activates adenylyl cyclase just like we've seen in the past, triggers the production of cyclic AMP just like we've seen in the past, and then cyclic AMP will activate protein kinase A just like we've seen in the past. But what's really awesome about this pathway is that what protein kinase A is going to do is it's going to change the activity of these proteins that are basically it's going to change the activity of these proteins shown here in red that are preventing the DNA from splitting and preventing meiosis from completing. So what protein kinase A is going to do is tell these chromosomes, tell these proteins, hey, it is time for you guys to divide. You have been chosen this month. You need to resume meiosis. Protein kinase A is saying, I know you've been stuck in this stage for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, but it is your time now. And so what it's going to do is add a phosphate group, like any good kinase does, to these proteins. That changes their activity. They kind of pop off. And now the DNA can actually split to resume meiosis. So this is what's happening every single month in the female menstrual cycle. FSH is telling the follicle to mature, but it's also telling the developing egg in the inside, it is time for you to continue mitosis and split up those chromosomes into different cells. And the reason I kind of wanted to mention this was not just because it helps us review GPCRs and what FSH does, but this actually explains why there's an increased risk in genetic defects or genetic abnormalities when the maternal age increases. So you guys might have heard or seen data like this, where as the age of the mother increases, the risk of certain genetic diseases, so for example, Down syndrome or DS, begins to rise with maternal age. And the reason that is because over time, these structures that are holding the chromosomes together, keeping the cells stuck in meiosis, they become, in a way, harder and harder to separate. You can think of them like getting rusty over time. It's going to be harder for us to break them apart. So sometimes these chromosomes are going to stay stuck together even as the egg develops. And what that could lead to is that too many chromosomes get put into one egg because they don't separate properly. And that could lead to things like Down syndrome. Because basically what Down syndrome is somebody is born with an extra copy of chromosome 21. And so that meant during the course of the menstrual cycle, that particular egg did not divide properly. It did not continue meiosis properly. These chromosomes did not split into different cells. They both went to one cell. But in any case, normally what we should do is trigger meiosis again, mature the follicle, and then the next goal we said was to trigger the release or ovulation of the egg from the ovary. So we needed to do this, have it mature with FSH, but then have it be released, and we said that was due to that positive feedback spike in LH or luteinizing hormone. Then we said that step 3 was just in case that egg that got released gets fertilized, we need to have a good home ready for it to develop and mature. So we need to get the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, to get nice and thick. So we need to build the endometrium, and we saw that was thanks to estrogen and progesterone. So again, one pathway, hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and gonads in the females, the ovaries, was responsible for accomplishing all of our goals. And we just added some tweaks about negative feedback, positive feedback, and what's actually happening. But hopefully I've convinced you that this pathway The female menstrual cycle is both kind of pretty simple because it's just one hormone pathway, but it's also crazy complicated and really interesting and the basis of life. And that's why I think this is, in a way, one of the most interesting topics we're going to cover this entire semester. But it's also really cool because it helps us go full circle with the stuff that we started the semester with: negative feedback, positive feedback, etc. So all those very basic concepts that we started the semester with, they play a huge, huge role in the basis of life and the female menstrual cycle. And we're done. That's it for the content this semester. Don't cry. I'll say this in class, but I'll say it now. Thank you all again for your hard work this semester, for your dedication, for adapting to our course style, for allowing me to be your professor. It's been such an honor and a privilege to work with you guys. I've loved helping, and hopefully you feel like I was always willing to help. And in this final couple weeks of the semester, if you haven't realized it yet, I am always here to help, and you should feel free to reach out to me as we go through the final stretch. So again, thank you all for your hard work, your sacrifice, and if anything comes up, give me a shout. See you guys in class.